The pride, the thrill of success, the sense of purpose that flowed through you. But now, all that seems like a cruel joke. You thought you knew who you were, until failure came crashing down, shattering that illusion with brutal force. How did it happen? Where did it all go wrong? You're no longer sure of anything. The image in the mirror has morphed into a stranger, and you're left asking, is this who I really am? But here's the kicker. The very question of who you are seems almost irrelevant now. The familiar contours of your self-perception have dissolved into a mess of contradictions, a blurry collage of dreams, regrets, and what-ifs. In this moment, you feel the crushing weight of failure bearing down on your chest. But beneath the surface, there's something far more insidious at play. Something that isn't just about a missed opportunity, a career setback, or a broken relationship. Something deeper. Something more fundamental. What if failure isn't the problem at all? What if it's the very way you see yourself, the very lens through which you interpret the world, that has betrayed you? Failure, in many ways, isn't a singular event. It's an ongoing process. It sinks its claws into your soul not just through external setbacks, but by hijacking your internal narrative, by whispering that you are, in fact, nothing more than your failures. It redefines your identity, telling you that you are only as valuable as your most recent success, or your most recent fall from grace. Now, imagine what it would feel like if you could peel back that narrative, like layers of old paint on a wall, and discover that you are not defined by any of it. What if you could rebuild your identity from the ground up? What if you could take this moment of despair, of self-doubt, and turn it into something that pushes you forward instead of pulling you down? But here's the paradox that challenges everything you've been told. What if failure is the key to discovering who you truly are? You're probably questioning that right now. How can failure possibly lead to self-discovery? Isn't it supposed to be the opposite, the thing that shatters our sense of self, leaving us adrift in a sea of uncertainty? Yet, somehow, in the chaos of destruction, there lies a path to rebuilding. What if I told you that your sense of worth isn't tied to success? Or failure, for that matter? What if your identity is not some rigid construct built on external achievements, but a fluid, evolving process shaped by deeper forces than you could ever imagine? How do you rebuild yourself after something as cataclysmic as failure? Is there even a way out of this maze of self-doubt, self-criticism, and regret? Or are you doomed to wear the scars of your mistakes forever, trapped in a cycle of self-punishment that leaves you no room for growth? These are the questions that haunt you, but you haven't yet found the answers. You stand at a precipice, staring down into the abyss of your own mind, knowing that something needs to change, but you have no idea how. What if you could transcend this crisis of identity? What if, by facing your failures head-on, you could unlock the deepest, most powerful version of yourself? But before you can answer these questions, you must first understand why they haunt you so relentlessly. What makes failure feel so personal? Why does it tear at the fabric of your identity with such brutal force? The answers, as you'll soon discover, are not what you might expect. They're buried deep within the human psyche, within your psyche, hidden beneath layers of societal conditioning, emotional trauma, and existential fear. But to begin to rebuild, you must first understand what you're really up against. Are you ready to confront these hidden forces? Because the journey to self-recovery is not for the faint of heart. Let's dive into what's really at play here, and uncover the unseen forces that have been guiding your sense of self all along. To understand why failure shatters your identity in such a profound way, you must first dive deep into the psychology of self. The very notion of who you are, your sense of selfhood, isn't a simple, fixed thing. It is constructed, shaped, and constantly evolving. And in this evolution, failure has a role far more complex than most people realize. At the heart of this is a paradoxical truth. Your identity is not as stable or self-contained as it might seem. In fact, the very idea of a permanent self is a myth, one that we cling to because it offers comfort, a sense of continuity in a world that is ever-changing. Carl Jung, one of the most profound psychologists to ever walk this earth, spoke often of the shadow self. The shadow is the part of us that we push into the unconscious, the aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge or accept. These are the traits we deem undesirable or unacceptable, our weaknesses, our fears, our mistakes. When failure strikes, it often forces us to confront this shadow in a way we're not prepared for, because failure exposes the vulnerabilities we've spent years hiding. Failure becomes a mirror, showing us who we are without the armor of success. And in that reflection, we often see someone we don't recognize, or worse, someone we deeply fear. Failure asks you to confront the ugly truths about yourself. It forces you to acknowledge your inadequacies, your shortcomings, the parts of you that never quite lived up to your expectations. It's no wonder, then, that many of us fight so fiercely against failure. We view it not as an isolated event, but as an existential wound. The discomfort it brings runs much deeper than a financial setback or a professional loss. It questions the very foundation of our identity. But what if this destruction of the self isn't merely a tragic consequence of failure? What if it's actually an invitation, a challenge to look deeper into the nature of who we really are? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most controversial philosophers in history, famously proclaimed, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." In essence, he argued that the human spirit could endure tremendous suffering so long as it had a sense of purpose. Failure, in this context, isn't an end. It's a revelation. When failure forces you to question who you are, it also strips away the false narratives you've built about yourself. It challenges you to discover a truer version of yourself, not defined by external accomplishments, but by something deeper. But this process isn't easy. Nietzsche also warned of the nihilism that can result from failure, the sense that life has no inherent meaning when stripped of success and validation. Without the sense of purpose or self-worth that comes from achievement, many people collapse into despair, believing that they are nothing. This is where the true psychological damage lies. Failure can rob you not only of your accomplishments but of your very belief in your ability to create meaning. Yet, in the depths of nihilism, there is another possibility. The will to power, according to Nietzsche, isn't about dominance or control over others. It is the will to overcome, to create meaning in a world that seems indifferent or hostile. This can be the key to rebuilding your identity after failure. It is not the absence of failure that grants meaning to life, but the ability to rise from it, to see it not as a destruction of self but as a fertile ground for reinvention. Arthur Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's philosophical predecessor, offered another insight into this predicament. For Schopenhauer, human beings are driven by an insatiable will to live, a desire for success, pleasure, and validation. But this will, he believed, is also the source of our suffering. It is the endless striving for more success, more recognition, more achievement, that ultimately leads to pain and disappointment. Failure is the moment when this relentless striving hits its limit, forcing us to confront the meaninglessness of our pursuit. Schopenhauer's vision is a sobering one. Success and failure are both fleeting. They offer temporary satisfaction or dissatisfaction, but neither can provide lasting peace. This perspective may seem bleak, but it holds the key to understanding the deeper roots of failure's destructive power, our attachment to outcomes. The question, then, is not how to avoid failure, but how to redefine our relationship with it. What if failure itself isn't the enemy? What if it is the attachment to our successes, and the identity we build upon them, that holds us captive? Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, would argue that identity is not something inherent or predetermined. It is something we create in each moment through our actions. Existence precedes essence, he said, meaning that who you are is not defined by any singular achievement or failure. It is defined by the choices you make, by how you respond to the circumstances around you. In this light, failure becomes a part of the human condition. It is not a terminal event that ends who we are. It is a challenge that shapes us, that forces us to make new choices, to redefine what we stand for. Sartre believed that we are all condemned to be free, meaning that every moment is a chance to create ourselves anew. Failure, in this sense, can be a liberating force, a chance to break free from the past and reinvent who we want to be moving forward. But this is not an easy road. It is far easier to give in to despair, to let failure consume you, to cling to old identities that no longer serve you. It requires strength and courage to face the abyss of your own psyche and to make the conscious decision to rise from the ashes. And yet, there's something even deeper at play. Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, taught us one of the most profound lessons on the human experience. He believed that even in the most horrific circumstances, such as imprisonment and torture, the human spirit can find meaning. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, reveals a simple but revolutionary idea. Meaning does not come from external circumstances, but from our inner response to those circumstances. When failure threatens to break you, Frankl's insight becomes crucial. Failure is not the end of your story, it is a page in your story. How you choose to view it, how you decide to respond, is what determines whether it will destroy you or catalyze your transformation. This is where the real work begins. If you can learn to detach your sense of self from external outcomes, if you can embrace the reality of failure as part of the human experience, you will open up a new realm of possibility. You will begin to see that failure is not an identity-shattering event, but an opportunity to reconstruct who you are from the ground up. But there is one more truth that you must confront before you can begin the process of rebuilding. A truth that cuts to the heart of human existence. This truth is not easy to face, but it is essential for true transformation. Are you ready to see the unseen consequences of living in a world where failure becomes a personal indictment of your worth? Failure does more than just shake your identity. It subtly warps your perception of the world and your place within it. The consequences are often invisible, hidden behind layers of cognitive biases, societal conditioning, and the deep-seated psychological forces that govern your behavior. And it is these unseen forces that dictate how failure influences not just your emotional well-being but the way you interact with life itself. To begin, let's consider a simple yet profound insight from cognitive science. Human beings are inherently pattern-seeking creatures. We look for cause and effect in everything, even in situations where none exist. This is a survival mechanism that has served us well throughout evolution. The brain is wired to find order in chaos because it helps us make sense of the world and take action. But this same tendency leads us to construct meaning where there might be none, and it magnifies the emotional impact of failure. When you fail, your mind, seeking to make sense of the event, starts to create a narrative. And this narrative isn't just about what happened, it's about who you are, what you deserve, and how you relate to the world around you. The problem is, the brain often distorts this narrative, weaving together a story that exaggerates your flaws and amplifies the significance of your mistakes. This distortion is what psychologists call a cognitive bias, specifically the self-serving bias and the confirmation bias. When you fail, these biases work together to reinforce the negative perception you have of yourself. The self-serving bias tells you that your successes were due to your brilliance, while your failures are because of external circumstances or bad luck, anything but your own inadequacy. Yet, when failure happens, the confirmation bias takes over, pushing you to focus on every piece of evidence that supports the idea that you are inadequate, that you are unworthy. The mind conveniently ignores anything that might challenge this narrative. This cognitive trap is far more dangerous than it seems because it can create a feedback loop. Failure isn't just a momentary event, it becomes internalized. Every time you fail, this distorted perception becomes more entrenched. The consequences of failure are no longer limited to the external world, they begin to shape your internal landscape. Your identity becomes entangled with these self-constructed stories, and you lose sight of the possibility that you can ever be anything other than the sum of your past mistakes. This cycle of distorted self-perception is not only harmful to your emotional health, but it also isolates you from the opportunities for growth. It creates a kind of paralysis, a fear of trying again because you are convinced that failure is inevitable, that your worth is permanently stained by your past. This is where the societal consequences of failure come into play. We live in a world that relentlessly measures worth through success. From childhood, we are taught that our value is contingent upon our achievements. In school, we're graded on our performance. In the workplace, our promotions depend on results. Social media perpetuates this narrative, presenting an endless stream of curated successes while masking the failures. We are conditioned to believe that success is not just desirable, it is necessary. And this societal pressure has a direct impact on how we view failure. The hidden cost of this conditioning is profound. When failure happens in a society that values success above all else, it often leads to shame. Shame is a powerful emotional state that tells you that you are not enough, that you are broken, deficient, or unworthy. And shame is one of the most corrosive forces when it comes to rebuilding your identity after failure. You begin to see yourself as less than others, as someone who has fallen behind or failed to meet some societal ideal. This shame doesn't just live in the moment of failure. It festers, poisoning future attempts at growth and connection. It reinforces the belief that your worth is conditional, based on how well you perform in a world that rarely values failure as a stepping stone to success. Even more subtle is the way society fosters the illusion of permanence. When you fail, it feels like your story is over. The world moves on, but you're stuck in the past, trying to understand where you went wrong. This sense of finality is amplified by a world that demands immediate results and instant success. Failure, in this context, feels like an irreversible mark on your identity, something that cannot be undone. But this illusion of permanence only traps you further. And then there's the role of neurological conditioning. Your brain is wired to avoid pain and seek pleasure. Failure is painful. It triggers the brain's threat detection system, leading to a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol. This is part of the reason why failure feels so emotionally overwhelming. Your brain processes it as a form of trauma. And just like physical pain, emotional pain from failure encourages avoidance. The brain learns to associate failure with discomfort, reinforcing the belief that it is something to be feared and avoided at all costs. This avoidance mechanism is another unseen consequence of failure. Over time, it can create a life in which you shy away from risks, from challenges, from anything that might expose you to the possibility of further failure. This is how failure subtly shrinks your world. It traps you in a cycle of inaction, where you are constantly trying to protect yourself from the very thing that might set you free, a willingness to try again, to grow, to evolve. But there is another layer to this. Our culture places immense value on perfection. The myth of perfection is pervasive, appearing in everything from the images we see on social media to the expectations placed on professionals in every field. Failure, then, is seen as an anomaly, a flaw that must be corrected, hidden, or erased. This notion of perfection creates a toxic environment where even minor mistakes are magnified, and the pressure to succeed becomes suffocating. As a result, failure is not just seen as an inevitable part of the journey, it is seen as a personal failure of character. You are not just someone who made a mistake, you are a failure. This belief, if internalized, is devastating. It locks you into a fixed identity, a rigid self-concept that leaves no room for growth or change. The long-term consequences of this mental conditioning are staggering. It leads to anxiety, depression, a lack of self-worth, and an inability to take risks. It makes you afraid to fail, and in doing so, it keeps you from achieving your true potential. The pressure to avoid failure becomes so great that you stop even trying, suffocating the very possibility of success. So, what happens when these unseen consequences run unchecked? What happens when you continue to see yourself through the lens of failure, when you let these biases and societal pressures dictate how you move through the world? You become trapped, not by the failure itself, but by the identity that failure creates for you. And it is this identity, the one forged in the fire of past mistakes and distorted perceptions, that you must challenge if you ever hope to rebuild. But how can you break free from this cycle? How do you transcend the conditioning that tells you failure defines you? To answer this, we must first confront the final, most critical realization. The way you've been taught to view failure is all wrong. The moment you begin to realize that everything you've been taught about failure is an illusion, you step into a powerful new space. It's a space where everything you thought you knew is called into question, and the boundaries that once seemed so fixed begin to dissolve. It's a place of rebellion, an inner revolution that challenges the very structures of thought that have kept you bound to your past mistakes. This isn't just a moment of intellectual clarity. It's a radical shift in how you perceive yourself, how you respond to failure, and how you choose to move forward. And here's the most revolutionary insight you can embrace. Failure is not the end of your story. This might seem counterintuitive, even blasphemous, given everything you've been taught to believe about failure. But think about it. What if the very thing you fear the most, the idea that failure could define you forever, is actually the key to your liberation? In his groundbreaking work, Viktor Frankl wrote about finding meaning in suffering, and this applies directly to failure. He believed that even in the most dire of circumstances, whether that be imprisonment, loss, or failure, the human spirit could find meaning. Frankel's own experience in Nazi concentration camps showed him that people could endure unspeakable hardship as long as they had a reason to keep going, a sense of purpose that transcended their suffering. When you fail, the first impulse is to see that failure as an indictment of your character, a sign that you've come up short or fallen behind. But Frankel would urge you to see it differently. He would ask you to find meaning in the failure, not as something to avoid or erase, but as something to learn from, to grow from. This shift in perception, from seeing failure as the end to viewing it as the beginning, is the key to your transformation. The question, then, is not about avoiding failure. It's about how you respond to it. It's about taking control of your narrative, reshaping the meaning of failure in your life. This requires a radical rethinking of the relationship between identity and failure. Most people build their identity on the foundation of their successes. They define themselves by the accolades, the titles, the accomplishments they can point to as proof of their worth. But what happens when those external markers of success crumble? What happens when failure takes everything from you? The key to rebuilding your identity is realizing that your sense of self is not, and should never be, defined solely by your external achievements or failures. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would say that your identity is not preordained. It's something you create through your choices, your actions, and your willingness to evolve. Every time you choose to stand up after a fall, every time you decide to keep moving forward despite the voice in your head telling you that you're a failure, you are in the act of becoming. Your identity is not fixed, it's fluid, a constant process of reinvention. And this is the most radical part of the solution. You have the power to reshape your identity at any moment. But to do this, you must dismantle the belief that you are your failures. When you stop seeing yourself through the narrow lens of past mistakes and perceived shortcomings, you create space for a new story to emerge, one that is not bound by what you've lost but empowered by what you are capable of becoming. History is full of individuals who embody this mindset. Take Thomas Edison, for example. The great inventor failed thousands of times before finally inventing the light bulb. Each failure was not an indication that he was not meant for greatness, but an essential step in the discovery process. Edison's famous quote, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work," illustrates a mindset that doesn't view failure as a mark of incompetence but as a necessary part of growth. In Edison's eyes, failure was a teacher, not an executioner. Or consider the story of J.K. Rowling, who faced rejection after rejection before finally finding a publisher for Harry Potter. At the time, she was a single mother living in poverty, and her story seemed destined to be one of quiet defeat. But instead of succumbing to the weight of her struggles, Rowling used her failure as fuel. She chose to rewrite her narrative, to keep moving forward despite the overwhelming odds stacked against her. The world now knows her as one of the most successful authors of all time, but that success didn't come without a radical reimagining of what failure meant to her. These examples are powerful because they show us that the most extraordinary achievements often come from those who have faced failure head-on and chosen to see it as an opportunity, not a death sentence. But how do you make this shift in your own life? It starts with the decision to embrace a new mindset, one that sees failure as a stepping stone, not a tombstone. This doesn't mean you ignore your mistakes or pretend they didn't happen. It means you refuse to let them define you. You refuse to allow failure to determine your worth or limit your potential. Instead, you take what you've learned from the failure, extract the wisdom it has to offer, and move forward with renewed determination and clarity. One key to this process is developing resilience. Resilience isn't about avoiding pain or failure. It's about your ability to bounce back after being knocked down. It's about developing a mindset that views obstacles as challenges to overcome, not as insurmountable walls. In his book Grit, psychologist Angela Duckworth explains that the key to long-term success isn't talent, but perseverance, the ability to keep going, even when the going gets tough. Resilience allows you to keep pursuing your goals, regardless of the setbacks and failures along the way. And this is where you reclaim your power. Every time you rise after failure, every time you choose to keep moving forward despite the pain, you become stronger, more capable, more attuned to the depths of your own resilience. You stop being a passive victim of circumstances and become an active creator of your future. There's a deeper element. When you embrace failure as part of your human experience, you also learn to embrace your imperfections, your vulnerabilities, and your flaws. You stop seeing them as things to be ashamed of and begin to see them as part of the rich, messy tapestry of what it means to be alive. This acceptance doesn't mean complacency, it means freedom. The freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to fall, and the freedom to rise again. Once you stop fearing failure, you also stop fearing imperfection. And it is in this space of radical acceptance that true transformation occurs. It's time to break free from the self-imposed prison of perfection, to release the need for external validation, and to reclaim the power to create your own identity. But this rebellion isn't easy. It requires you to confront the deepest fears and insecurities that have shaped your worldview. It demands courage to step into the unknown, to risk failure again and again in the pursuit of something greater than success. The question now is, are you ready to embrace the transformative power of failure, to use it as the fuel for your own reinvention? Because when you do, you will begin to see the world not as a place where you're destined to fail, but as a vast, open canvas, waiting for you to paint your own story. Failure is not the villain. It's the guide, the necessary force that helps you become who you were always meant to be. The final truth is simple, yet profound. You are not defined by your successes or your failures. Not by your achievements, nor by your mistakes. These external markers are fleeting, ephemeral even, and they do not, and never will, define who you truly are. This revelation, when fully grasped, shatters the very foundation of the self-concept that has been built up over the years. It's an unsettling truth, a paradox that challenges everything you've believed about identity, purpose, and meaning. It's a truth that simultaneously frees you and terrifies you. You are already whole. This isn't some feel-good, cliché statement meant to comfort you in the wake of failure. It's the core of a deeper, existential realization that transcends the need for external validation or success. The self you've been seeking through your accomplishments, through your victories and defeats, was never the real you. What you've been chasing is a mirage, a projection of who you think you should be, based on external expectations and societal norms. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in the history of psychology, spoke extensively about the concept of individuation, the process of becoming the most authentic version of yourself. For Jung, true identity wasn't about fitting into a predefined mold or chasing after societal accolades. It was about the integration of all aspects of the self, the light and the shadow, the successes and the failures. It was about accepting the entirety of your being, not just the parts that are easy to love or admire. This is the ultimate freedom, to know that you are not defined by any one experience, by any single success or failure. Failure has a unique ability to expose the fragility of the self-concept you've constructed. But this fragility is not something to fear, it is something to embrace. What failure shows you, if you allow it to, is that your identity is not built on a solid foundation, but on shifting sands. The beauty of this revelation lies in understanding that the self is not static. It is constantly evolving, constantly growing. It is not confined by a fixed narrative, not shackled by a set of outcomes. And herein lies the freedom. Failure does not break you, it releases you. The fear of failure is the fear of confronting the truth that who you think you are is a story you've told yourself, a role you've played for others and for yourself. It is the fear that if you fail, you will cease to exist as you know yourself. But when you embrace the fact that failure is not the end of your identity, it is the beginning of an evolution, you unlock the potential to create yourself anew. The real tragedy is not in failing, but in failing to recognize that you can choose who you become after failure. This is the profound freedom of existential thought, as articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence. You are not born with a fixed identity or purpose. You are a blank canvas, and every decision you make, every action you take, every failure you endure is part of the process of becoming who you are. Identity is something you actively create, and it is not confined by past mistakes, nor does it rely on external validation. Your essence is in the choices you make now, and in the meaning you assign to your experiences. In this sense, failure is not an enemy of your identity, it is its most powerful ally. Failure forces you to confront the illusion that you were ever in control, that your identity was ever fully constructed. And in that confrontation, you are given the chance to rebuild. You are not defined by what you have achieved, nor by what you have lost. You are defined by the capacity to create meaning, to decide who you are in every moment. This is the essence of freedom, the ability to choose again, to redefine, to break free from the constraints of past failures, and to write your own story on your own terms. This truth also reveals something deeper about the nature of success itself. In a world that prizes external achievements, success is often treated as the ultimate measure of a life well lived. But when you understand the truth that your identity is not tied to any external measure, success and failure take on entirely different meanings. They become less about validation from the world, and more about growth and experience. Success is no longer something to be attained to prove your worth. It becomes the journey of self-discovery, of becoming more fully yourself in the process of living. A powerful illustration of this can be found in the life of Nelson Mandela, whose identity was not defined by his imprisonment, nor by the political or social systems that sought to break him. His ultimate success came not from his political victories, but from the profound internal transformation that allowed him to forgive his oppressors and to rise above the personal and societal forces that sought to crush him. Mandela's story demonstrates the power of choosing who you will be in the face of tremendous failure and adversity. His true identity was never shaped by the circumstances of his life, but by his ability to rise, to evolve, and to transform through each setback. When you embrace this final truth, you will begin to see failure in a completely new light. You will no longer see it as something that diminishes your worth, but as something that amplifies your potential. Failure is an integral part of the human experience. It is what teaches you resilience, humility, and growth. It is not an obstacle to be avoided, it is a force to be harnessed. It reveals to you the fragility of the identity you've been holding on to, and in that fragility, you find the raw materials to build something far greater. This is the ultimate liberation, understanding that your essence is not fixed, but ever-changing, ever-growing. You are the author of your own story, and you can always rewrite it. Your failures do not define you. They are the brushstrokes on the canvas of your life, guiding you toward a deeper understanding of who you are and who you are becoming. In this realization, there is peace and power. The peace comes from knowing that you are enough, no matter what has happened in the past. The power comes from the freedom to choose, to create, to rise, and to redefine yourself at every turn. The cycle of failure no longer holds you in bondage. It becomes the very force that propels you toward your next chapter. So, as you stand at the crossroads of failure and reinvention, ask yourself this: if I am not defined by my failures, if I am not bound by the past, then who will I choose to become? You will find not only the freedom to rebuild your identity, but the profound truth of who you are meant to be. In the end, you are not defined by what you lose or what you gain, but by who you are meant to be.